A document appeared briefly on the Senate Legislative Council website at 11:47 last night, visible for only 9 minutes before being removed. In that short window, 3 congressional researchers managed to download it, and what it revealed explains why, at this very moment, the United States government is functioning without a reliable chain of command. Before diving into the content of that document, you need to understand 3 critical events from the past 18 hours that mainstream media is failing to connect. First, a classified security briefing invoked continuity of government protocols. Second, a sudden spike in the bond market acted as a signal that usually precedes wars or coups. Third, a quiet legislative maneuver in the Senate allows Congress to bypass presidential authority entirely. While these incidents occurred independently, they all converge on one alarming possibility: a president who cannot or will not be restrained by constitutional limits. On Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency meeting at the Pentagon, unannounced and off the public schedule, confirmed only by 3 defense officials. The exact phrase used during the meeting was continuity of government protocols, a term that is far from routine. Continuity of government is a constitutional safeguard designed to maintain governmental operations during catastrophic events such as nuclear war or major terrorist attacks. It was last invoked on the 11th of September 2001. This is not ceremonial language. When military leadership requests a review of these protocols, it indicates a scenario where the normal chain of command may fail. That morning, at 6, the meeting took place. Just 3.5 hours later, at 9:30 a.m., the bond market opened and Treasury yields spiked immediately. While bond yields often appear abstract to the general public, institutional investors treat them as precise risk indicators. On Wednesday, something unprecedented occurred. Goldman Sachs circulated an internal memo to major clients, which leaked within hours. The memo included one phrase that caused instant concern among professional traders: institutional risk assessment elevated to Category 4. Category 4 is the highest risk designation used by Goldman Sachs, reserved exclusively for war or coup scenarios, not for recessions or routine political uncertainty. By 2 p.m., 4.5 hours after the market opening, Senate Majority Leadership quietly invoked a seldom-used procedural mechanism under Senate Rule 22, which allows the Senate, under specific emergency conditions, to fast-track legislation without requiring a presidential signature. No press release was issued, no floor speech delivered, only a procedural notation in the congressional record. The significance of this maneuver is immense. It creates a legal path for Congress to act independently if the executive branch becomes unresponsive or threatens constitutional stability. Within 8 hours, 3 separate branches of government took independent actions, all preparing for a potential constitutional breakdown. That night, the 9-minute document surfaced, titled Memorandum on Presidential Authority Limitations During National Security Emergencies, drafted by the Office of Senate Legal Counsel, a nonpartisan body of constitutional lawyers who advise the Senate on the legal boundaries of governmental power. Although the White House counsel objected, leading to its rapid removal, the content had already been downloaded. The memo is divided into 4 sections, and Section A, Constitutional Authority Analysis, immediately outlines a technical yet crucial question: when Article 1 powers granted to Congress and Article 2 powers granted to the President conflict, which takes precedence? The document cites 72 years of historical precedent, including the landmark 1952 Supreme Court case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. During the Korean War, President Truman attempted to seize steel mills under the guise of national security because striking workers threatened wartime production. The Supreme Court rejected his executive order, ruling that even in wartime, the president cannot exceed constitutional authority. Congress retains control over commerce and domestic policy, and an emergency declaration does not allow the president to override that authority. Every president since Truman has operated within these boundaries, making this memo's citation particularly striking. It presents the Senate with the legal basis not merely to advise but to override presidential emergency powers. Section B, Emergency Powers Curtailment, reinforces this authority, explicitly stating that the Senate retains the power to nullify emergency declarations by a simple majority, directly challenging the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which broadly empowers the President. The memo asserts that even if Congress legally delegated emergency powers, it retains the constitutional right to reclaim them at any time. Section C of the memo is the point that triggered immediate alarm. On page 7, paragraph 4, the language is explicit. In circumstances where executive actions threaten constitutional order, Congress holds the inherent authority to temporarily suspend the transfer of military command pending judicial review. Let that sink in. This is not theoretical. The Senate Legal Counsel prepared a legal framework that would allow Congress to remove the President's command over the armed forces if deemed necessary. This is an operational, actionable plan, not an academic debate. That single paragraph caused the White House to retract the document almost instantly. But Section D, often overlooked, contains an equally stunning development. A list of 14 Foreign Service officers from the State Department's Office of Legal Advisor, career professionals who interpret international law and serve across administrations, both Republican and Democratic, some with 20 years of service. On Wednesday, all 14 submitted their resignations simultaneously. This is extraordinary because these positions are designed to remain steady through transitions, controversies, and partisan disputes. Their mass resignation sent a clear signal. They refused to provide legal cover for actions they believe could threaten constitutional integrity. This exodus was mirrored in the Pentagon, where Joint Staff lawyers circulated internal guidance on distinguishing lawful from unlawful orders. While soldiers are trained to refuse illegal commands, this guidance is typically only shared in specific legal training scenarios, not during routine operations. The memo targeted senior officers, those responsible for deciding whether to execute or reject presidential directives. Meanwhile, the intelligence community acted in unison. 5 agencies simultaneously restricted the White House's access to sensitive compartmented intelligence, citing concerns over proper handling. Translating this bureaucratic language, the agencies effectively communicated that they did not trust the president with top-secret intelligence. When the CIA, NSA, DIA, and other agencies independently withhold classified information from the commander-in-chief, it is a sign that the permanent national security apparatus is protecting itself from the elected government. Amidst this, Senate Republican leadership faced a critical decision. A meeting in Mitch McConnell's office Wednesday morning included 6 key figures. McConnell himself, bringing decades of Senate institutional memory, John Thune, the minority whip responsible for vote counting, John Barrasso, conference chair managing party messaging, John Cornyn from Texas, facing re-election in a trending purple state, Mike Rounds of South Dakota, a veteran with armed services experience, and Susan Collins from Maine, a member of the Intelligence Committee with access to classified briefings. Before this meeting, a briefing by the Senate Legal Counsel introduced an unprecedented scenario: criminal liability for members who enable unconstitutional acts. Under Title 18, United States Code, Section 2384, seditious conspiracy. While normally applied to militia groups or domestic terrorists, the Council outlined a situation where senators expanding emergency powers could become personally criminally liable if those powers were misused to suspend elections or deploy the military against civilians. This reframed the risk. Supporting the president could now mean risking federal prosecution, not just political consequences. McConnell categorized the risks: political, electoral, and legal. Political risk was familiar managed over years of primaries, media attacks, and voter sentiment. Electoral risk reflected immediate dangers, including the impact of Trump-adjacent chaos on swing states like Texas, which polling showed costing 4 points. But legal risk was absolute and irreversible. Once criminal liability was on the table, seniority, wealth, or reputation offered no protection. Each senator in the room understood that their choices carried potential permanent consequences. McConnell proposed a letter to the White House, not a press release or floor speech, explicitly stating 3 positions: The Senate would not expand emergency powers without clear constitutional justification, would not campaign with the president unless foreign policy rhetoric was moderated, and the National Republican Senatorial Committee would support incumbents threatened by primary challenges from the president. Each senator's agreement was recorded, including the longest 30-second pause from Barrasso before consenting. The symbolic letter was followed by tangible action. Thursday morning at 8 a.m., Senate Resolution 47 was filed. Unlike ceremonial resolutions, this one held operative authority. It declared, in precise language, that notwithstanding any executive declaration, the Senate retains full authority to nullify emergency powers by simple majority vote, effective immediately upon passage. This phrase alone represents a constitutional earthquake. The president's objections, opinions, and veto power are rendered irrelevant. The resolution establishes a fast-track mechanism to overturn emergency declarations, requires only 51 votes, and takes effect immediately, bypassing presidential approval or judicial review. It is grounded in Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, granting each House authority over its proceedings, a principle repeatedly affirmed by the Supreme Court in cases like United States v. Ballin, 1892, and Nixon v. United States, 1993. No other branch can interfere. The vote count for Senate Resolution 47 made the situation even more extraordinary. 17 Republicans had committed to supporting it, along with all 51 Democrats, including the 2 independents caucusing with them, totaling 68 votes, far beyond the simple majority required. This was no close call. It was a supermajority coalition, making the outcome virtually certain. At this point, Trump could post on social media, hold rallies, threaten primaries, or launch personal attacks against senators, but constitutionally and legally, none of it mattered. The Senate had established a mechanism to strip emergency powers from the president, with no avenue for him to prevent it. Executive orders, vetoes, or even declaring a new national emergency would not stop the vote. The resolution itself would immediately nullify any unilateral action. This created a uniquely dangerous scenario because history shows that cornered authoritarians rarely surrender quietly. Nixon, facing imminent impeachment in 1974, escalated before resigning, firing the attorney general, and attempting to shut down a special prosecutor investigation. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin faced parliamentary limits in 1993 and responded by shelling his own legislature. In Turkey, 2016, Erdogan survived a military coup attempt by purging 15,000 officers and arresting 50,000 people, consolidating authoritarian control. The pattern is consistent: resistance triggers escalation. With this context, analysts outline 3 potential pathways from this moment. Scenario A, capitulation, sees the president backing down, moderating rhetoric, and claiming a victory and asserting authority over the Senate, a 15% probability, given behavioral patterns over decades. Scenario B, legal guerrilla warfare, is far more likely, around 60%. Trump could challenge the Senate resolution in federal court, instruct executive agencies to ignore it, claim it illegitimate, and create competing legal frameworks where his emergency powers remain valid, resulting in constitutional chaos with 2 branches asserting conflicting authority. Scenario C, the most extreme, carries a 25% probability. Here, Trump declares a separate national emergency, invokes the Insurrection Act to deploy the military domestically, and presents the Senate as staging a legislative coup, forcing them to choose between immediate impeachment or acquiescence. While improbable, it is not impossible, and history shows that high-pressure situations often push leaders toward the extreme. Meanwhile, the international response was already underway. Thursday morning at 3 a.m. Brussels time, the NATO Military Committee convened an emergency session to assess U.S. political stability, a historically unprecedented move. NATO has never in 75 years formally evaluated the political reliability of the United States, which is the cornerstone of the alliance and guarantor of Article 5 collective defense. If NATO questions America's chain of command, the post-World War II security architecture faces potential fracture. Simultaneously, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, including the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, quietly elevated classification requirements for shared intelligence. While the official reasons cited operational security, two intelligence officials confirmed that Allied agencies no longer fully trusted the U.S. administration with top-secret compartmented information. Their concern was protecting sources and methods from their own partner. At the same time, the European Union began drafting a democratic backsliding sanctions framework, previously applied against Hungary and Poland when those governments violated rule of law standards. The framework focuses on sanctioning individuals rather than nations, signaling that European allies are prepared to hold American officials personally accountable if constitutional norms fail. Across the Pacific, China's People's Liberation Army elevated readiness around Taiwan on Wednesday night, a move synchronized with U.S. domestic instability. Beijing is calculating whether Washington can respond coherently to simultaneous domestic and international crises. For 80 years, global stability relied on the assumption that America is predictable. If that assumption fails, everything else is destabilized. This convergence of domestic constitutional crisis and international scrutiny highlights the stakes. American institutions are being tested, and the outcome could reshape global and domestic power dynamics in unprecedented ways. The stakes are immediate and profound. There are four potential paths forward. Path 1 sees the Senate resolution pass with 68 votes, curtailing emergency powers and legally containing the president, though political tension persists, with the 2024 election unfolding under uncertainty. Timeline: 2 to 3 weeks. Path 2 involves Trump challenging the resolution in court, reaching the Supreme Court, and forcing conservative justices to weigh Senate authority against presidential power, creating 1 to 2 months of legal limbo where it is unclear who holds legitimate authority. Path 3 occurs if Trump defies the resolution outright, continuing to issue emergency declarations and instruct agencies to ignore Congress, forcing the House to pursue impeachment. With the Senate lacking two-thirds support, removal fails, resulting in stalemate for 3 to 4 months. Path 4 is the invocation of the 25th Amendment, temporarily removing the president while requiring congressional approval to make the removal permanent. While feasible, the threshold is extraordinarily high. The most likely sequence is Path 2 leading to Path 1, legal challenge, resolution affirmed, emergency powers curtailed, but institutional damage becomes permanent. To bring the picture full circle, consider the chain of events that unfolded within just 48 hours. A secret legal memo, available for 9 minutes, mass resignations of senior bureaucrats, the Pentagon circulating internal guidance on lawful versus unlawful orders, the intelligence community restricting presidential access to classified information, and Senate Republicans moving decisively to assert legislative authority over emergency powers. This is not about partisan politics. It is about the resilience of American constitutional institutions when confronted with potential authoritarian impulses. The Constitution, crafted 237 years ago, is being stress-tested in real time, and the question is whether its mechanisms, checks, balances, and separation of powers can contain concentrated executive authority in the modern era. What is at stake is not simply the current president. If the Senate successfully asserts its authority and curtails emergency powers, future presidents will operate within defined constitutional boundaries. If, however, these limits are breached, future occupants of the presidency inherit a role with no effective constraints. The confrontation is a stark choice between the rule of law and the rule of individuals, between constitutional order and personal power, between democratic norms and authoritarian instability. While the domestic crisis unfolds, international actors are watching closely. NATO convened to assess U.S. political stability. The Five Eyes intelligence partners increased compartmentalization of shared information. The European Union prepared sanctions frameworks aimed at individuals, and China adjusted its military readiness around Taiwan. Every signal indicates that global institutions no longer take U.S. political predictability for granted. Markets, too, have been responsive, with bond yields spiking as institutional investors interpret signals of risk that ordinary Americans might not notice. Goldman Sachs's internal memo elevating risk to Category 4 underscores the severity of the situation, placing it in the same category as war or coup scenarios. In essence, within 2 days, domestic governance, national security, financial markets, and international alliances have all been affected by a single, accelerating constitutional crisis. The procedural response in the Senate is both precise and unprecedented. Resolution 47 asserts the Senate's plenary authority over emergency powers, a mechanism grounded in Article 1, Section 5, which allows each House of Congress to determine its own rules. The resolution bypasses presidential veto, executive orders, or judicial review. In practice, this means the Senate can immediately nullify emergency declarations with a simple majority vote. The supermajority coalition supporting the resolution, 68 senators, ensures certainty of passage. This unprecedented alignment demonstrates that, regardless of partisan loyalty, lawmakers are prepared to act to preserve constitutional norms. Legal and bureaucratic structures are moving independently of politics to protect institutional integrity. The scenario is not theoretical, it is operational, legal, and immediate. Trump's actions, from public threats to executive orders, cannot override the mechanisms now established by the Senate. Every step taken by the Senate, the courts, and career bureaucrats is designed to enforce constitutional limits, and the procedural clarity of Resolution 47 ensures that there is no ambiguity about the Senate's authority. Despite these structural safeguards, the human element remains unpredictable. History demonstrates that cornered leaders rarely comply peacefully. Nixon escalated before resignation, Yeltsin shelled his own legislature, Erdogan purged thousands to maintain control. Understanding these historical patterns is critical for assessing risk. Analysts categorize probable outcomes as capitulation, Trump moderates and steps back; legal guerrilla warfare, he challenges the resolution in court, creating constitutional ambiguity; or extra-legal escalation, he invokes separate statutory authority to deploy the military, challenging Congress directly. Each path carries different probabilities, but the historical record suggests that legal guerrilla warfare is most likely. While the legal resolution eventually restores constitutional boundaries, institutional damage, both domestic and international, may be long-lasting. Allies have already responded with contingency plans, sanctions, frameworks, and elevated intelligence safeguards. This global response highlights a fundamental truth. American constitutional crises do not remain domestic. They reverberate across alliances, trade agreements, and security commitments, creating ripple effects that can alter geopolitical calculations for months, if not years. All of this leads to a stark reality. The events unfolding over these past 72 hours are not merely political theater, they are a test of the Constitution itself. A legal memo briefly exposed, mass bureaucratic resignations, military lawyers preparing to distinguish lawful from unlawful orders, intelligence agencies withholding sensitive information, and the Senate asserting unprecedented authority over emergency powers, all converge to challenge whether American institutions can withstand concentrated executive power. The outcome will determine not just the current administration's limits, but the framework for all future presidencies. The Constitution is being tested in real time, and the question is whether its checks and balances are robust enough to contain authoritarian impulses in the modern era. If the Senate successfully curtails emergency authority, it establishes a precedent, ensuring that presidents operate within boundaries, reinforcing the principle that no individual can unilaterally override the system. If these limits fail, the presidency could inherit unchecked authority, destabilizing the balance of power and eroding democratic norms. This is the confrontation between rule of law and personal power, between constitutional order and authoritarian risk, and between enduring democratic institutions and the threat of unilateral governance. The next 72 hours will unfold faster than any cable news network can analyze. The stakes are not simply partisan, they are institutional. Analysts expect a sequence in which Trump initially challenges the Senate resolution in court, creating legal ambiguity, followed by affirmation of Senate authority and eventual curtailment of emergency powers. The legal outcome, however, cannot erase the institutional damage already done. Bureaucratic resistance, international contingency planning, and financial market signals illustrate that confidence in American governance has been shaken. Allies are preparing for instability, markets are pricing in risk, and domestic institutions are navigating unprecedented operational constraints. Global stability, long predicated on American predictability, is now in question. Every action taken by the Senate, the courts, and permanent government officials is a measure to safeguard constitutional integrity. The Constitution is being applied as designed, checks and balances in real time, limiting individual authority while preserving institutional function. But the intensity of this test raises a fundamental question for citizens, lawmakers, and international partners alike. Can the American system withstand the pressures of concentrated executive power without eroding the very norms it is designed to protect? To fully grasp the implications, it is essential to recognize that these developments extend far beyond Donald Trump as an individual. The crisis examines the capacity of the Constitution and its institutions to act as a firewall against authoritarian impulses. It challenges whether fear-based political control can be countered through collective institutional action. The Senate's assertive measures, combined with bureaucratic and international responses, demonstrate a coordinated effort to reinforce the boundaries of presidential authority. In practical terms, this determines the rules under which future presidents will operate, ensuring that emergency powers cannot be expanded unchecked. At the same time, it exposes vulnerabilities in the system, showing how rapidly institutional integrity can be tested when political and legal boundaries collide with personal power. Every action, every resignation, every procedural maneuver is a signal that American constitutional democracy is being actively defended. Yet, the situation remains volatile, with legal, political, and institutional outcomes all intersecting in real time.